want you to see the language here. Go to chapter 6, verse 2. Let me encourage you to underline. Every time you see some kind of authority given, or some kind of permission given, or some kind of allowance given by God in these chapters. Look at chapter 6, verse 2. This first rider. I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and underline this, a crown was given to him. A crown was given to him. Then go to verse 4. You have the second rider, bright red. Out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted, was given allowance, was given permission, was permitted to take peace from the earth. And you get down to verse 8. Last rider on a horse. I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And they, here it is, they were given authority over a fourth of the earth. They were given. So, crown was given, permission was given, authority was given. Begs the question, who's giving it? God's giving it. These riders have nothing in and of themselves. The only thing they have, they've been given by God. The only authority they have, the only permission they have, they've been given by God. And this continues. Go to the next chapter, chapter 7, verse 2. Then I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun with the seal of the living God. And he called with a loud voice to the four angels, here it is, who had been given power to harm earth and sea. 4 angels were given power to harm earth and sea. Next chapter, chapter 8, verse 2. Let's go a little bit past where we're even reading tonight. I want you to see this. Chapter 8, verse 2. Then I saw the 7 angels who stand before God. And here it is, 7 trumpets were given to them. 7 trumpets given. Verse 3, another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints. There's chapter 8. Keep going to chapter 9. Look at verse 1 in chapter 9. As these 7 trumpets are being blown. It says the 5th angel blew his trumpet, and I saw a star fallen from heaven to earth. And here it is, he was given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit. He was given this key. He didn't have it before. It was given to him. Verse 3, then from the smoke came locusts on the earth, and they were given power like the power of scorpions of the earth. Verse 5, they were allowed to torment them for 5 months. They were allowed to do this. Let me show you one more chapter. Chapter 13, all over chapter 13. We're going to see this in a few weeks, but this beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads. Listen to this description, verse 5. Chapter 13, the beast was given a mouth. He was given that, uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. Go down to verse 7. It was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. It was allowed to do that. An authority was given to it over every tribe and people and language and nation. Goes on, chapter 13, the second beast, and listen to verse 14. By the signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on earth. By the signs it's allowed to work. Verse 15, and it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast. So, do you get the point? These beasts and riders on horses and trumpets and angels doing this or that, it's all under the sovereign control of God. Even evil. So follow this. This is what we're going to see all over Revelation. It's clear. Satan and his demons in Revelations can do nothing apart from divine permission. They are on a leash. It's the same picture we've seen in the book of Job. As Satan attacks and he afflicts Job in various ways, we know he's only doing what he's doing under divine permission. Even amidst evil, Christ is in control of it all. So these 4 horsemen, you come back to chapter 6, are not out of control. They are in control. And ultimately, they are actually bringing about the purposes of God. Satan can do nothing apart from divine permission, and suffering is always used to fulfill divine purposes. God is accomplishing his work, his purposes here. So put yourself in the shoes of first century brothers and sisters, wondering what was going on when Nero crucified scores of Christians after the fire of Rome in AD 64. wondering what is going on when cities are struck by earthquakes, when evil is abounding in the world and suffering is abounding in the church, and it looks like it's chaotic and it looks like it's out of control. These visions offer a vivid reminder that Christ is in control and God is ultimately sovereign even over evil and Satan and suffering. See it in chapter 6, verse 10. These saints who've been slain, they've been martyred, they've been murdered because of their testimony to the Word of God. Listen to what they cry out. Verse 10, they cried out with a loud voice, "O sovereign Lord, holy and true." Yes, the title they use there for God, sovereign Lord, the title there is despotes. It's the word title from which we get despot, one with absolute rule and absolute authority. It's the same title that the saints in Acts chapter 4 used when they first began to face persecution. They cried out to God, "O sovereign Lord." This is the cry of saints who've experienced suffering in this world of all kinds throughout all history. And it is to be the cry of saints in this room tonight who are walking through difficult times. Look up to heaven and see the despot, the sovereign Lord. Amidst the chaos, we trust that He is in control. And He's working all these things in your life, in my life, in our church. He's all the world. He's working all of it together for the good of those who love Him and who have been called according to His purpose. Even the worst things, He's working together for good. God is ultimately sovereign, even over evil, Satan, suffering. At the same time, second truth we see here in Revelation 6 and 7, men and women are morally responsible for evil. So, from one horseman to the next in chapter 6, we see evil and sin spiraling on the earth. These images, vivid colors of white and red and black and pale green. Images of horsemen that remind us of depictions of sin and war in Zechariah 1 and Zechariah 6. And these images show us the depravity of man on display. One writer said, in these four interconnected seals, we see human depravity running its course upon the earth. It's a picture of what we hear about in Romans 1, God giving men over to their sinfulness. From the desire to conquer one another in that first horse, to civil war and slaying one another in that second horse, resulting in injustice and famine in that third horse, all leading to death. We're seeing the sinfulness of man come full circle. And the deafening truth that rises to the top from Revelation chapter 6 is clear. Men and women are decidedly sinful. Decidedly sinful. Progressing deeper and deeper and deeper into sin and strife. Slaying one another. Men and women are decidedly sinful, and men and women are dangerously self-destructive. So see the effects of sin here. They eventually turn on one another and slay one another, resulting in injustice among each other. This is a picture of sin. Sin always leads to self-destruction, which makes you wonder, why do we keep going back to it? It's the foolishness of man, and it's all of our tendency in this room to continue to go back to that which destroys us. All sin, even the littlest sin that you are holding on to, that you would call little, that you are holding on to, is absolutely, utterly destructive. Sin destroys you. Sin destroys others. But that's the importance of this imagery, isn't it? After all, Satan doesn't tempt us with an image of a rider on a dark horse leading us away to death. No, he masquerades as an angel of light, and he tempts you and me with enticing pictures of sin and pleasure. Don't buy it. Revelation 6 urges us to remember that sin destroys, sin devastates, and ultimately sin damns. The rider on the fourth horse makes clear that men and women deserve death. This is the result of sin. A quarter of the human race wiped out at once. That number will become more significant as we progress. But don't miss the overall point here. In our efforts to try to figure out, what does this rider mean, this horse, this part, we can miss the whole point. Robert Mount said, reviewing the various interpretations assigned to these four horsemen tends to rob the contemporary reader of the dramatic nature of the vision itself. It's good for us to place ourselves back in one of the seven churches and listen to the visions as they are being read. Instead of discussing the probable significance of each of the four colored horses, those first listeners would have recoiled in terror as war, bloodshed, famine, and death galloped furiously across the stage of their imagination. So see the picture tonight. Sin is all around us, luring us, tempting us, attempting to lead us, and it is devastating, destructive, ultimately deadly in its effects. Men and women are morally responsible for evil, which leads to the third truth. God will judge men and women who turn from Him and live for this world. So what we're seeing unfold in these seals is divine judgment and divine justice from God toward a sinful world upon sinners who turn from Him and live for this world. And I use that terminology very intentionally. Look back at chapter 6, verse 10 for a minute. When these saints who have been martyred cry out, O sovereign Lord, holy and true. Listen to what they say. How long before you will judge and avenge our blood on, now maybe underline this phrase right here, those who dwell on the earth. Those who dwell on the earth. Now that's the phrase. We've seen it already, and we're going to see it more. Try to point it out as we walk through the rest of Revelation. That's how non-Christians are most often described in the book of Revelation. Non-Christians are those who dwell on the earth. And the picture is, they're those who live for this world, those who worship the idols of this world. People who live for this world instead of living for another world, who put their hope in the things of this world instead of putting their hope in God. So it's really interesting. Believers are described as those who are living for another world. Unbelievers described as those who dwell on the earth, those who turn from God and live for this world. And chapter 6 says they are under the judgment of God, a reality that becomes particularly clear in this sixth seal in verse 12. Follow along there. Just imagine this scene. When the Lamb opened the sixth seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake. And the sun became black as sackcloth. The full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth, as the fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll that is being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. These verses are loaded with Old Testament prophetic pronouncements, and New Testament for that matter, of God's wrath that is coming upon sinners. Isaiah 13, Isaiah 24, Isaiah 34, Ezekiel 32, Joel 2, Habakkuk 3, Matthew 24, Mark 13. This same scene, this earthquake, we're going to see repeated again in the sixth trumpet in Revelation chapter 11, and then associated with the seventh bowl in Revelation chapter 16. And we may not know exactly when, what is going to happen, but we do know this. God will judge men and women who turn from Him and live for this world. The scope of His judgment will be cosmic in scope. William Hendrickson writes, try to visualize what John saw, taking the picture as a whole. Heaven itself curling up like a piece of paper, rolling up like a scroll. The sun, its light blotted out so that it resembles a black sack used in mourning. The big full moon becomes a huge, awe-inspiring, bloody ball. The stars turned out of their orbits and plunging to the earth in great showers. The earth itself quaking violently so that every house crashes to the ground and every mountain and island suddenly disappears. What a picture of dread and despair, of confusion and consternation for the wicked. Just imagine, and it makes sense, doesn't it? Romans 1 tells us that the essence of sin is worshiping created things rather than the Creator who alone is due praise. And so the Creator takes everything in creation, everything from the sun and the moon and the stars and the sky and everything underneath them, and He obliterates it all, making clear nothing in creation is worthy of worship. None of the things that you and I turn our hearts from God toward are worthy of worship. One day they will be gone. The scope of His judgment will be cosmic. All of our idolatrous earthly securities are going to prove utterly insecure. The breadth of His judgment will be universal, Verse 15 gives a list of every type of person, kings and great ones and generals and rich and powerful and slave and free, all, without exception, all of them, they're hiding themselves in caves among the rocks of the mountains. The shaking of the heavens will strip away all social distinctions. The judgment of God will level humankind. Everyone, from kings and presidents to children and the poor, all equally will cower before the presence of God the judge. And cower is the right word because the effect of God's judgment will be terrifying. Everyone, the Bible pictures here, is hiding from the face of God, from the wrath of Christ. Yes, the wrath of Christ the Lamb. Don't miss this. You don't want to meet God face to face apart from saving faith in Christ. You will long to escape his presence. Revelation 6 pictures the people crying out for rocks and mountains to crush them, for that would be better than facing the wrath of God and sin. Some people think or say, well, hell's not that bad a place to be. After all, if all these people who've lived it up in the world are going to be there, then it might be kind of fun. Don't be fooled. Utterly foolish. The effect of God's judgment will be absolutely terrifying upon those who have turned from him. And the duration of his judgment will be eternal. So, to jump ahead even here in the narrative to chapter 8, verse 1, the seventh seal is open and there is silence in heaven. And scholars debate what that silence signifies. And we're going to talk more about it next week when we get there, but it's clear all over the Old Testament that the judgment of God evokes silence in men. You think about, what do you say? What do you say to the sight of the earth evaporating and men, women, and children everywhere crying out for rocks and mountains to crush them before the face of Christ the Lamb? It's a horrifying scene. We're going to talk more next week about how that silence is coordinated with the prayers of the saints. But certainly part of the point of silence in chapter 8, verse 1 is to cause us, like John, just to sit back for a second and soak in this awe-inspiring, horror-inducing reality. God will judge men and women who turn from him and live for this world. His judgment will be cosmic. His judgment will be universal. His judgment will be terrifying, and it will be eternal. On that day, the door of God's grace will be closed forever to those who have turned from him. That's why chapter 6, verse 17 ends with a question. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand? Who among men can stand before this God? And Revelation chapter 7 beautifully answers that question. God will judge men and women who turn from him and live for this world. And God will save men and women who trust in him and live for another world. So 2 pictures of the people of God in Revelation chapter 7. The first, verses 1 through 8, a throng of 144,000 people representing the 12 tribes of Israel. The other, verses 9 through 17, a multitude that no one can count from every tribe, people, language, and nation. And not surprisingly, there's quite a bit of debate over who's included in these groups. Certainly they're both describing people of God, but this first group, is it literally 144,000 Israelites? Is it representative of all ethnic Israelites, Jewish people who will be saved before the second coming of Christ? Is this a figurative representation of all the people of God, Jews and Gentiles alike? And the second group, is this a picture of martyrs who have white robes, just like the ones in chapter 6 have white robes? This is a picture of all God's people finally united together, the consummation of God's kingdom. And again, we could spend hours here talking about that, all kinds of valid possibilities here, but I am persuaded that these 2 pictures are pictures of the same people from different perspectives at different times. So follow with me here. Let's start with the time. We learn here in chapter 7, verse 1, it says, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth, which, based on Zechariah, is likely a reference to the 4 horsemen we just saw described at the beginning of chapter 6. And another angel calls to them in verse 3 and says, do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. And so what this picture's doing here, it's taken us back to before the seals were even opened, before the earth was shaken and destroyed. And so this picture depicts God before he sends this devastating judgments on the earth in chapter 6, marking his people to protect them amidst the tribulation that he was about to bring. So follow this in your notes. Revelation 7, 1 through 8 is showing us that Christians are secure on earth in the midst of tribulation. Secure. Servants of God, verse 3, a term that is always used in Revelation to describe all redeemed believers. Here, represented with a complete number. We've talked about symbolic numbers, 144,000, a number that we're going to see describe God's people again in chapter 14. And then later, when we get to Revelation 21 and 22, we're going to see the New Jerusalem as a city with 12 gates, which are 12 pearls, on which are written the names of the 12 tribes. The city has a wall, 144 cubes in height, with 12 foundation stones, on which are written the names of the 12 apostles. This is a symbolic picture. Not a part of the church or a section of the church or even just an ethnic group among the church. Nowhere else in Revelation is there ever mention of Jewish believers apart from Gentile believers. This is the church, organized, described like an army, preparing to go into battle amidst suffering and tribulation in the world. What had been prophesied back in Daniel chapter 12. And God says, before the battle even begins, I have secured them for this battle. Now that doesn't mean the battle will be easy. Follow this in your notes. We've already seen in chapter 6 that God plans the persecution of his people. God plans the persecution of his people. Chapter 6, verse 10 and 11. You want to put something on your date chart for determining when Jesus is going to come back? Write this down. Chapter 6, verse 11 says, wait until the last saint is martyred for the gospel. Then Jesus will return. So write down, when the last martyr dies, and then as you write it, realize it may be you. The effect is, we lay aside our charts and lay down our lives proclaiming this gospel to the ends of the earth, no matter what it costs. That's the point here.